Greetings everyone, and welcome to ACSM's From Around the Field Science Webinar, Physical Activity and Exercise Intensity Terminology. The intent of the From Around the Field series is to familiarize our ACSM students and young professionals with the breadth of science that ACSM members conduct. I'm Dr. Laura Young from ACSM, and I'm excited to introduce you to our presenter today, Dr. David Bishop from Victoria University, Australia. Dr. Bishop is the current Research Director at the Institute of Health and Sport and leads the Exercise Prescription Laboratory at Victoria University. Professor Bishop has authored more than 300 peer-reviewed articles in the area of exercise and sport science. His research has been funded by numerous organizations, including the ARC, the NHMRC, and the Australian Defence Force. He is also the past president of Exercise and Sport Science Australia, or ESSA, and the assistant editor of MSSE, and the inaugural editor-in-chief of the new Exercise Medicine and Health Journal. Today, Dr. Bishop will cover the importance of standard physical activity and exercise terminology outlined in the ACSM and ESSA joint statement that explains the different methods, research, and rationale to determine and monitor different exercise intensities. The presentation will last for about 40 minutes, and then the webinar will open for question and answer. If you have any questions for Dr. Bishop during the presentation, please type them into the question area on the GoToWebinar platform. As we begin, if you have any trouble hearing or viewing us, please disconnect and log back in or switch to a different internet browser or network. This usually helps with most connectivity issues. If you purchased a CEC for today's webinar, you need to watch the entire webinar to receive your CEC. The CEC will be applied to your ACSM account within 2 weeks. When the CEC is available, an email will be sent to verified viewers. A final reminder is that you will not be able to turn on your camera or unmute your microphone during the broadcast today. You will be able to type in the chat and the question area on the GoToWebinar platform. We are now ready to turn it over to Dr. Bishop for his presentation. We hope you enjoy.
Okay, thanks Laura, and good afternoon everyone. As Laura said, today I'm going to present a summary of our recent expert statement published with the American College of Sports Medicine together with Exercise and Sport Science Australia, which looked at physical activity and exercise intensity terminology. Before I start, I just want to notice to acknowledge the team. So it was a huge team effort from people from all around the world to do our best to try and unify the intensity terminology that is currently out there. So thanks to all these guys, and we probably spent a couple of years working on the final document. The final document, as I said, has been jointly published, so you can see the two versions there. There's a copy in Medicine and Science and Sports and Exercise, of course, and the Australian equivalent, the Journal of Science and Medicine and Sport. So I'll try and give an overview today, but if you're interested in more detail, you can go to each of those, either of those publications. They're identical except for some of the formatting. So I think everyone here is very familiar. We know that physical activity is good for us, and people have been proposing physical activity to improve health and prevent disease for thousands of years. Not only, Plato, this quite famous, but ancient Greeks, ancient Indian societies, pretty much all around the world you can find examples of where people have been promoting exercise for health. Quite notably, this then led to the American College of Sports Medicine Initiative, the Exercise is Medicine Initiative. And if we're going to treat exercise as medicine, then like any other medicine, then the dose becomes really important. So if you went for, cholesterol medication or any other type of medicine, there would be a very specific dose that the doctor would give you based on your personal circumstances, your background, other things that you're doing, comorbidities, etc. When it comes to exercise, most people are familiar with initially the FIT, but now it's been modified more recently to the FIT VP. So the key principles of exercise prescription are frequency, intensity, time, type, the volume, and progression. I specifically chose this image because it shows the Chinese version as well. So you can find this all around the world again. But as with language, it's really important that the language is consistent if we're going to accurately prescribe exercise and get the best benefits out of exercise. And so I really like this quote here. So there is no greater impediment to the advancement of knowledge than the ambiguity of words. And I think, as I'll show you in the next slide, that hasn't always been the case with physical activity and exercise terminology. So what we see is that, different disciplines, so we have physical activity, we have exercise science, we have sports science, we also have personal trainers and physiotherapists who tend to come from a slightly different background and with slightly different words, which can have slightly different meaning. And I think, as I said, I'll try and explain this a little bit more on the next slide, but that was the position that we were coming from, is that without this consistent terminology, then the prescription of exercise has the potential not to be as effective. So this is one of the figures from the paper that was published, and hopefully I think you can see here, and I'll take you through it, where some of the confusion can arise. I guess in sports science, you quite often see people talk about zones, and I think that's quite an acute issue at the moment. When we're looking through this, some people, researchers or practitioners, may have 3 zones, say zone 1, 2 and 3. I've seen up to 9 zones in other models, and you see this argument around the moment about zone 1 or zone 2 training, and quite often they may not even be talking about the same intensity. When it comes to exercise science, the most common terminology is here. So you can see moderate, heavy, severe, and extreme as the 4 domains of exercise. Whereas physical activity, over many years and publishing some different sort of position statements as well, have come up with ranging from sedentary through to very light, moderate, vigorous, and then depending on the organization or the researcher, near max to max, very rigorous and high. And then down the bottom over here, I've got some of the different RPE descriptors, depending on whether it's a range from 6 to 20 or the 0 to 10 range. As I said, I want to highlight where I think there is potential for confusion. And probably the first zone here, so you can see here, if you're a sports scientist, you might call this zone 1. If you're someone who uses the exercise science domains, you might call that moderate intensity exercise, whereas someone in physical activity would be calling that light intensity. And then you've also got the different RPE terminology, somewhat easy, weak, light, etc. So you can see here that you might find from, say, physical activity, epidemiological research, people saying that there needs to be more moderate intensity exercise, but that could be based on research that's been done using this terminology, where moderate intensity exercise is actually the light intensity. I'll come to also resistance training soon, but I think these terms, and we talk about this in the position statement, the idea of describing something as heavy or light, I think can also be problematic, because you could have, as I'll show you later, light weights lifted many times, which then becomes a high intensity. So mixing something which is about the load and the intensity, so the load could be light, but the intensity could be moderate or high, I think is also problematic. And you can also see here what we tried to do, and this is another table from the publications, is when I tried to put together the different intensity descriptors from some of the more well-known guidelines. You go from sedentary, very light, light, moderate, hard, very hard, vigorous, high, near max, and maximal. And it was really hard to actually even to line up the different recommendations because of the different intensity descriptors that we use. And so these are, obviously the ACSM, and also in Australia, two of the most well-known exercise and sports science societies, but they still have quite very different terminology. And the same comes to when we look at resistance training. There's been over the years different proposals. Some have been based on up here, depending on percentage of 1RM. And so there's some that have suggested that similar to VO2 max, so if you wanted to have 80% of VO2 max, then the equivalent way to prescribe exercise intensity for resistance training would be using percentage of 1RM. So 80% of 1RM might be an equivalent intensity by that argument. And what we talk about in the paper, again, is that for us, that is mixing and conflating load and intensity. And you can also see here, as I said, the repetition range that is described as moderate intensity differs depending on the source. And then there's been others that have proposed using the repetitions possible. So if you're using, and again, I guess this is referencing more the load, if you're using a very high load and doing high intensity, 1 to 5 repetitions maximum, then that's been described as high intensity, whereas doing many repetitions has then been described as low intensity. So we argued that we didn't think that was the best way to be describing intensity, and this is the way, I guess, we tried to illustrate that. And I think anyone who's done any resistance training would be familiar with this, that even if you start with quite a low weight, if you lift that 20, and it might be low intensity, the amount of times, if you lift that to fatigue, eventually the last few reps will become high or even very high intensity. So just using the number of repetitions possible, we didn't think that was the best way to describe intensity. So based on that, and again, maybe it sometimes seems simple in the paper, but there's probably a year of discussion. What we ultimately came for, and we didn't always agree at the beginning, but there was agreement to this after we had some debate and Zoom chats, etc., is this was the proposed terminology. So two things we wanted to try and do. One is to try and have some sort of unified terminology for cardiorespiratory exercise and resistance training. And so we settled on very low, low, moderate, high, and very high for both resistance training and cardiorespiratory training, and the corresponding RPE descriptors of very easy, easy, somewhat hard, hard, and very hard. So you can see there quite deliberately we removed the reference to light or heavy from the RPE descriptor. And the other thing we thought just linguistically, even though it's quite well established, the physical activity terminology, but it seems to mix, we felt, different terms. So it go from light to moderate to vigorous, whereas linguistically, if we anchor on moderate, then having less than moderate is low intensity, high intensity, very low, and very high intensity. So that was our thinking there. So I guess after coming up with this, our proposed standard terminology, the question then becomes, how do you actually demarcate or determine these different intensities? And notwithstanding, I guess we appreciate that not everyone's going to have access to a physiology laboratory, but we felt like there had to be physiological determinants of these cardiorespiratory exercise intensities. And the best way we felt to do that was around the metabolic thresholds and also the VO2 max. So you can see here we have our 5 intensities, and so below the first metabolic threshold is where we had low intensity. Between the first metabolic threshold and the second metabolic threshold is where we had moderate intensity. Between the second metabolic threshold and VO2 max is where we had high intensity, and then anything above VO2 max intensity we described as very high intensity. There's probably a couple of things just to point out here. One is that there's no physiological marker that we could find to demarcate the very low and low intensity. Notwithstanding that, we debated this quite a bit, we still kept the very low intensity, and we did that for a couple of reasons. One is because it lines up with many of the current guidelines, such as the ACSM, which have 5 intensities. And the second is that given the evidence that, going from sedentary to doing really any activity is of benefit, we felt it was important that there was also a very low intensity within our recommendations. So it may be impossible task, but maybe in the future there will be a better way to separate very low and low intensity physiologically. And I guess the other one, we call them the metabolic thresholds, to acknowledge that there's, depending on the facilities and expertise, there's different ways that these thresholds can be determined. So some people will determine the first metabolic threshold with lactate, whereas some people might use ventilatory measures such as the ventilatory threshold or the gas exchange threshold. And similarly, there's different ways to determine the second metabolic threshold, the respiratory compensation point, maximal lactate steady state, critical power, and critical speed. One of the issues, and probably a lot of people watching this presentation are thinking the same thing, is that obviously a couple of things is not everyone has access to a physiology laboratory where they can measure metabolic thresholds and VO2 max, and also given the population it's probably just not feasible to be able to measure these values in every single person who we want to prescribe physical activity or exercise to. So we spent a lot of time in the paper talking about other markers of these intensities. And really the conclusion is that there aren't really great other markers. Most of them, they're quite variable, but they're probably necessary from a practical point of view. And also more research will hopefully be able to refine these markers. But to give you an example, like the METS I know is very popular, and it's also within the ACSM guidelines, but really the range of METs with which someone can be in a different intensity depending also on their fitness level, makes it very difficult to be able to prescribe exercise intensity accurately using the METs, and maybe there'll be some questions about that in question time. Even RPE, if you really dig into the literature, is not that great a marker. If you look at the average, it's quite good, but I'd encourage you to any paper that's looked at RPE as a marker of different intensities, there's always quite a very large standard deviation. And quite often, for people more familiar with statistics, they'll report the standard error, which underestimates the variability in the measure. But what we've tried to illustrate here, and this is based on the literature, again, depending on fitness and population, there's a very wide band of RPE values that can correspond with the different intensities. So one of the things that we talk about in the published papers is that because of the difficulty in getting access to a physiology laboratory for everyone, we acknowledge there is a need for other markers. We acknowledge that RPE can be useful in some situations, but what we argue is that RPE is probably best used if the intensity has already been established using a more robust method like the metabolic thresholds or the VO2 max. In terms of resistance training, again, as I said, we've got the same 5 intensity descriptors: very low, low, moderate, high, and very high. And drawing your attention back to this, there's a couple of principles that we thought of. One is that load refers to how heavy, whereas intensity refers to how hard. So we don't think it's appropriate to use a percent of 1 RM as a marker of intensity. And as we've shown there, the number of repetitions and the load will combine to determine the intensity. And so a method that's becoming more and more popular is the one that we suggest in this position stand, is using repetitions in reserve. Because really what that's telling us is how close you are to not being able to lift anymore, and that will be in determining the intensity. So you can see here that whatever the load you're lifting, if you get to the point where you think you can't lift it more than 2 times, then that would be a very high intensity exercise and would be described as very hard. This will probably come up in question time as well, but I think we've had already this position stand is starting to generate some debate, as we hoped. And one of the questions that has been coming up has been, I guess, more specifically about exercise programming. And so there have been questions about, well, shouldn't we be using percentage of 1 RM if we want to get people to do hypertrophy training or strength training or power training? Isn't that a better method? And so what we've argued, and I guess there'll be some letters to the editor coming out, is that's actually a different question. So that's about programming. So when you talk about using the FIT principle, we're talking about the load, the number of repetitions, the rest between sets to achieve a particular training outcome. That's actually a different question of what we're dealing here. So what we're dealing here is just the definition or the terminology that describes the intensity of the training that someone's doing. And so I guess what we finished up with, and this is the second table and final table in the paper, is some proposed classifications and criteria. So it's not an intensity, but obviously there's inactive. And then for both resistance and cardiorespiratory training, we go from very low to very high. Physiological references that we suggest for cardiorespiratory exercise, and then the repetitions in reserve method to be able to prescribe a certain resistance exercise intensity, and then the corresponding RPE values. One of the last things we say in the paper is that, you know, this position stand is not the final word. And, you know, I guess the well-known quote in any science is that, you know, standing on the shoulders of giants. So, you know, we've built this and we've made this recommendation based on, you know, probably at least 100 years of research, and we've proposed some terminology and methodology to determine these different intensities that at this point in time we're quite confident in, but hopefully this position statement will generate lots of questions and we'll be able to improve, and it'll also drive research in the future that will allow us to improve this even more. As I said, there's already been a couple of letters to the editor. I'm hoping also that there'll be lots of great questions after this presentation that we can then incorporate into future position statements to improve the way that exercise intensity is described. So thanks everyone for listening. Thanks to the ACSM for the opportunity to present today, and I'd welcome any questions that you might have.
Greetings, everyone. This is Dr. Laura Young from ACSM. And unfortunately, we do have a change of plans for today, and we will not be hosting a Q&A session with Dr. Bishop. However, we do hope to create a follow-up blog that includes responses to any questions that we do receive about this presentation. We hope to post this blog on our ACSM media channels so that everyone can receive some follow-up today. Again, we thank you for joining us today. This presentation will be freely available on the ACSM Learning Management System and on the ACSM website, freely available for ACSM members. And we, again, thank you for sharing your time with us. We are going to end a little bit early. Please stay tuned for information regarding next month's From Around the Field presentation in April. Again, thank you, everyone. Have a great day, and we'll see you at the next one.